Be sure to check Facebook for all upcoming events and extra things like road closures, day-to-day events, funerals, etc. Our website, lakeviewchurch.com, is the go-to place for general information. So like us on Facebook and be in the know.
For the month of July and August, we are moving to one summer service time at 10 a.m. So what that means is don't come at 9:30 because you'll be a little bit early, and don't come at 11 o'clock because you'll be really late. I know you could do this. I believe in you. July and August, one service, 10 a.m.
Hey parents, want a break from your kids this summer? Athletes in Action Soccer Camp is happening August 8th to 11th. If you sign up before July 1st, it's only $100, so register online to kick off your summer.
Hey families, it's time to sign up for Lakeview's Underground Church. It's happening July 23rd to 27th. Meet me at the newsstand or register online at Lakeview Kids.
So this summer, we're doing this teaching series entitled Hope Dealers. And every person that is going to come and join you on stage is going to talk about how hope has been made real in their life. Now, when I think of hope being made real in my life, I think of Zellers. Let me explain. About 14 years ago, after spending 2 years in Vancouver, going to grad school, which I loved, and living in a city that I loved living in, my family and I moved back here to Saskatoon. Now, when we were in Vancouver, we had scored ourselves this amazing townhouse down by Cole Harbour. We could walk to Stanley Park. It was just an amazing life. We really enjoyed it. And when we came back to Saskatoon, we had one vehicle. I was at home with 2 little kids. My 2 first kids were 5 and 1. And instead of hearing the sound of ocean waves, instead I heard that, wind that makes it minus 50 in January. And when the kids and I got a little bit squirrely, the place that we could go to get a break was Market Mall. Any other mothers been in that situation? Yeah, hi. We would go to Market Mall and do the routine, right? We'd go to Playland, we'd have some A&W for lunch, then we'd head over to the mini golf and look at the fish. And then we might stick some money in that dog, that for blind people, they raise money and the kids love to put money in there. And then we'd head to Zellers and check out the sales. So Stanley Park, Zellers. You can kind of see why I was feeling a little bit hopeless, like life felt a bit colorless to me. Well, in the middle of sort of this struggling, I was also working on grad school from afar, and one of the allotted texts for the class that I was taking was Dallas Willard's book, The Divine Conspiracy. And for some reason, even though I had probably read 100 theology books by that time, this book captured me. It converted me. It changed me. It helped me to see salvation in a new way. Because what Dallas Willard talks about in this book is that salvation isn't just about, getting your soul saved so that you can go to heaven when you die. Instead, salvation is about Jesus bringing God's world close to our world in the death and resurrection of Jesus. What God is up to is he's making all things new. He's not just saving our souls, he's on this great restoration project in the world. So while I was reading this book, the kids and I did one of our routine visits to Market Mall. And we were walking through Zellers, and for some reason, in the middle of Zellers that day, all of a sudden, I could just sense and see God's world just breaking into that world. And the ether, the air just seemed full of joy and hope in the middle of Zellers. Maybe another way that you could understand what was happening in my mind at this time was to think of a renovation project. So if you've renovated your home, you know that sometimes what happens is you look at the carpet and it's looking pretty shabby, so you think, yeah, let's take the carpet up. And when you do that, you realize, well, you might as well replace the baseboards. And then, well, we might as well paint while the baseboards are off, and then the casings come off the windows, and why don't we replace the windows, and then the insulation comes and the cupboards, and pretty soon you're renovating the whole house. Because one thing leads to another, because it's all interconnected. Well, salvation is a little bit like a holy renovation project. Here's how Paul puts it in the book of Romans. That's why I don't think there's any comparison between the present hard times and the coming good times. The created world itself can hardly wait for what's coming next. Everything in creation is being more or less held back. God reins it in until both creation and all the creatures are ready and can be released at the same moment into the glorious times ahead. Meanwhile, the joyful anticipation deepens. The joyful anticipation deepens. I think this was what I was experiencing as I walked through Zellers that day. I was sensing that creation is just waiting for its turn in this renovation project. But Paul also says here that creation is being held back. It's waiting. And why is it waiting? Well, some versions of these same verses put it like this. They say, creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the revealing of the children of God. And in order to understand what this means, I think it's helpful if we go right back to the beginning of the story. You'll find this in the first 2 verses of Genesis. First this, God created the heavens and the earth, all you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness, and God's spirit brooded like a bird over the watery abyss. So you know the story, right? God creates the world. He separates the sky from the water and the land from the water. He causes plants to grow, creates the sun, moon, and stars, tells animals to come to life in the sea and on the land, and finally, he creates us. And what does he say about his creation? God looked over everything he had made, and it was good. So very good. Now, part of the reason that creation was so good was because it worked together in perfect harmony. In fact, if we continue to read in this story, we see that the man and the woman didn't have any clothes on, and that was because they just felt perfectly comfortable in their own skin. We see that they walked with God in the garden at night. They enjoyed this perfect relationship with God. They were in perfect relationship with one another, and they lived in creation in harmony. But then everything changes in Genesis 3 when man and woman distrust God and decide to go their own way and eat the fruit of the tree that God told them not to eat of. And what happens is this fragmentation starts to happen. The first thing is that people experience this alienation from their own selves. They have to put on clothes. They experience shame. And then they hide in the trees so that when God comes for his daily walk, he can't find them. And then when he asks them who decided to eat the fruit, they blame each other. So they experience this alienation with one another. And then finally, they're kicked out of the garden. So they also experience this alienation with creation. And everything fragments and unravels, and there's alienation everywhere. And then the whole plot of Scripture from then on is this increasing alienation and fragmentation, all the while God attempting to put everything back together again, his unfolding plan to make all things new. And in the middle of the story, Jesus comes. And Jesus does for humankind what they cannot do for themselves, which is overcome this alienation, this fragmentation that humanity feels in all of these relationships. And he does this by dying and rising again. Jesus is sometimes called the second Adam in Scripture, and that's because just as sin spread through Adam and Eve and through their actions, so a new world order is created and starts in the person of Jesus. In fact, what N.T. Wright says about the resurrection of Jesus is that it's the announcement that what God did in Jesus, raising him to new life, is what he plans to do for the whole world. And so Jesus starts something new. He starts the beginning of a new end in the middle of the story. He begins God's renovation project of the whole earth. It starts with Jesus, but one day, all of the world is going to be included. Jesus was the beginning to this new end in the middle of history and end where all of the death and destruction that life throws at us will be swallowed up in resurrection. But there's more good news, because the next act of Scripture is the calling of the people of God to be the presence of the risen Christ in the world. And so we as the church are called to join in the renovation project, to be a part of the new humanity that is a witness to what God is up to in the world. Now, I need to clarify something, because it's not that we as people, by the way that we act in the world, actually make this end happen. Jesus' last words on the cross were, "It is finished." And what he meant by that was that through his death and resurrection, the end of history is inevitable. All things will be made new. The restoration project is going to happen. But in the meantime, we as humans are invited in to this mission of God to make all things new. We're invited into this sure future. Listen to this. The sons and daughters of God demonstrate their status by exercising the kind of dominion that heals rather than destroys, and to enact their rightful belongingness and to contribute to the ultimate restoration of creation. The sons and daughters of God are called to acts of healing and restoration instead of destruction. And this is the point that Paul is making, is that if you think salvation is only about your soul, it's kind of like ripping up the floorboards and forgetting about the baseboards and the paint and the windows and the cupboards. And so I wonder, where are we missing this broader view of salvation? Or to put it another way, where are you feeling most acutely an alienation in one of these relationships? Are you alienated from creation? Has it been a while since you've considered the consequences of your actions for the rest of the world? Have you thought about how your overconsumption might affect people in the other side of the world? Or have you thought about the ethical practices of companies that you regularly purchase from? Maybe there are small things that you can do in order to join in the overcoming this alienation with creation, like taking your cloth bags to the grocery store, or not buying bottled water, or not spraying your dandelions. Have you ever thought of those kind of actions as part of the salvation project? Or perhaps you just need to get into nature again. A few weeks ago, I was feeling pretty frayed and anxious and overwhelmed with my life. And I decided that one of the ways I was going to cope with this was just to get outside. So I jumped in the car and drove to Cranberry Flats. I left my phone in the car, took my earbuds out, which is a big part of it, right? And just listened to the sounds of nature and felt the wind on my face. I tried to get out into the yard some more, out for a run, did whatever I could just to get into nature. And soon I just felt, those frayed nerves just soothed, because we're meant to live with nature. Or perhaps your alienation is most acute with God. Does he feel like a stranger you haven't made contact with in a long time? Well, one of the most deepest realizations I made in those Zellers days was that God wanted my life just as it was. I kind of, had this, even though I knew this not to be true, I didn't really understand at a deep level that God wasn't just interested in my Vancouver, grad studies happy life. He was also interested in my Market Mall, stay-at-home mom kind of colorless life. He wanted to be present to me in that life too. So if you're suffering alienation with God, I just encourage you to start opening the channels of communication with him. All it requires in this moment is for you to turn your face to him and say hi. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to do anything differently. He probably will change and do things in you after you say hi, but you can start the conversation without doing that. Maybe you're suffering alienation in your closest relationships. Well, this is your encouragement to stay loving, to stay faithful, and to show up and see how God might be up to something new in those. Or maybe you're alienated from yourself. Are there wounds and memories that keep you from being your own good company? I encourage you to get counseling, to find help, to tell a friend, to pray, to sleep, to exercise. Go to the doctor, see if you need medication, whatever it takes to find healing in yourself and find some comfort in your own body and in your own life. Now, as we talk and think about the ways that we are experiencing alienation in our life, I feel this question rising in me, that if Jesus started this restoration project that he promises he's going to complete when he comes again, why is there so much of this alienation that we're still suffering? It seems like maybe something has gone wrong in God's restoration project. Well, the people that Paul was writing to in Romans had these same questions. In fact, they lived right after the time of the resurrection of Jesus. And so their expectation was that Jesus was going to come back right away and that all of life was going to be renewed. And instead of that happening, what they found was they were living under Roman occupation and they were being harassed and persecuted, and they didn't really understand why things were the way they were. And into that confusion, Paul writes this: all around us, we observe a pregnant creation. The difficult times of pain throughout this world are simply birth pangs. These sterile and barren bodies of ours are yearning for full deliverance. That is why waiting does not diminish us any more than waiting diminishes a pregnant mother. We are enlarged in the waiting. We, of course, don't see what is enlarging us, but the longer we wait, the larger we become, and the more joyful our expectancy. So in most versions of Scripture, instead of saying birth pangs, the word used is groaning. Creation is groaning, and we are groaning. So here comes a birth story. Now listen, I've grown up in the church, and I have had plenty of sports illustrations and car illustrations, and let's face it, we've had quite a few stereo illustrations over the last few years, right? So you guys get to have a birth illustration, something that the women can access especially. When I was expecting my second child, my dad and I were sitting together, about 5 days before that, just talking about this pending arrival. And the birth of my first child had been quite peaceful. There hadn't been a lot of noise for various reasons. It was pretty quiet. And my dad, who's a doctor, although he didn't deliver babies through his career, he did deliver babies in his internship and residency. And so we were sitting around talking about how some mothers are really loud when they give birth. They kind of scream and cry out, and maybe they're just really emotional, or they can't handle the pain. You know where the story is going, right? Because the day that Ella arrived, if you had gone into that labor and delivery ward and listened for the loudest groaning and mooing, and then followed those sounds and opened the door, you would have found yours truly, loudest mom on the ward. But what I learned through this experience is that groaning is not the noise of a mom out of control or unable to manage her pain or being overly emotional. Instead, groaning is a way of cooperating with the birth process. It's a way to move birth along, a way of working from inside the pain to give birth to a new creation. Lauren Winner puts it like this: the groans of labor signal the woman's active participation in the birthing process, a participation that does not fight the pain. Groaning is a tool used by women to bring new life into the world. And so what Paul is saying is that our suffering in the world has the potential to be like the groaning, the birth pangs that a new mom is suffering. It has the potential to bring about new life. This also gives us a clue to where new creation is happening, to where new life is being born, because it's not in the clean and quiet and sanitized corners of the world. It's where there's noise and mess and vulnerability. And this also makes sense if we look at ourselves as the church, as the people commissioned to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the world, right? Because if our job is to be Jesus' presence, then we need to do it like Jesus did it. And Jesus didn't win the power struggles, he lost them. utterly. He didn't look for popularity or prestige. He hung out with the people nobody wanted to hang out with and went to the places nobody wanted to go. And Jesus did not overcome death and suffering by avoiding pain, but going right into the center of it and transforming it from the inside out. Just like a mother giving birth, Jesus makes himself vulnerable. He bleeds, he cries, he tears in order to bring about new life. Which kind of turns our ideas of what it means to live a meaningful life on its head, doesn't it? This is what Barbara Brown Taylor says. Christians, contrary to all common sense, are to follow their leader into the scariest, most dangerous places in the world, armed with nothing but a first aid kit, because they, like him, are not fighters, but physicians, wounded healers whose credentials are their own hurt place. So, where are you feeling the birth pangs of God's new creation? Where is God inviting you to groan along with the suffering world in order to give birth to something new? Let me say this. In my experience, if there is a place of pain that you are actively avoiding, that's probably the place that God is calling you to. Pay attention to the places you are avoiding, the painful spots in yourself that you can't look at, as well as the ones outside of yourself. That person you don't want to run into, or that situation that kind of makes you sweat and feel anxious. Pay attention, because this is where new life has the potential to be born. Maybe this is an invitation to a participatory groan in the world in terms of social or justice issues. I think about our young adults who went to Beardy's to listen and learn about Indigenous people and their struggles in the spring. This issue is huge, it's complicated. We have made a mess out of it, and I don't think anybody really knows how to fix it. A generation ago, if you were white and middle class, you just pretended the issue didn't exist. I learned nothing about residential schools when I was in school, and I'm not that old. But this community of young adults were brave enough to go where the groaning is, to join in and to figure out how God is bringing new life there. And the thing is that often when we get closer to the groaning, sometimes the pain becomes greater and the chaos becomes greater. But that's okay, because often the pain and the chaos are greatest just before the baby is born, right? And we don't manage that pain and chaos by coming with solutions or answers. We come into that pain and chaos to join in, to groan along, and to wait for the new life to be born. Let's read the last section of this Romans passage. Meanwhile, the minute we get tired in the waiting, God's Spirit is right alongside, helping us along. If we don't know how or what to pray, it doesn't matter. He does our praying in and for us, making prayer out of our wordless sighs, our aching groans. He knows us far better than we know ourselves, knows our pregnant condition, and keeps us present before God. That's why we can be so sure every detail in our lives of love for God is worked into something good. The picture that Paul paints here reminds me of nesting dolls, those Russian matryoshka dolls, where you take off a lid and there's another doll and then another doll and another doll. What Paul is saying here is that the Spirit is present in us while we are present in the world. Us in a suffering world, the Spirit in a suffering us, all groaning together. The Spirit of God present to the world through us in the world, and the Spirit in us, just like a nesting doll. And this points to the interconnectedness of all things. Just as sin spread through Adam and life comes through Jesus, and now we have the potential to join our life with that as well. God shows us that he's interested in redeeming all of creation, but God is also interested in redeeming all of us. He's not just interested in our souls and our Sundays. He wants our physical, emotional, mental selves, and he wants all of our time, our Mondays to our Sundays. He wants all of us. When I was expecting my first baby, I changed every rhythm of my life in order to welcome that baby, to grow that baby inside of me. I changed my habits. I stopped consuming liquor. I limited my intake of caffeine. I made choked down milk and prenatal vitamins. I watched what I was eating. We left our apartment, bought a house, bought a new car. We changed everything about our life in order to welcome this new baby. And I wonder, how are we making room for God to be manifest in us? What rhythms and practices are we establishing that make God's Spirit feel welcome in our lives and make us attuned to what God's Spirit is groaning about? As this passage makes clear, one of the most vital rhythms to do this is prayer. Prayer is a way of cooperating with the Spirit of God in order to not just bring new life in the world, but grow new life inside of us. It's a way of participating in our own pain in order to bring new life. For instance, it's really easy to say from the stage to you guys, you need to forgive that person. But we know that when the rubber hits the road and you're the one who's been cheated on or betrayed or mishandled or abused, that it is really hard to forgive. It's a whole new beast, right? It's almost impossible. You need a miracle. The Spirit can do that miracle in you. And I know because it's happened in me over and over again. As I made room for the Spirit of God in my heart, we groaned together through the pain, we leaned into it, and little by little, new life was made manifest in me. Now, there's nothing like suffering to change our rhythms, to make us face God and make room for God. The disintegration of a marriage or the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job and illness, all of these things quickly dismantle our life and make a lot of space for the Spirit to groan in us. But what comes to us as bad news, I wonder, actually might be the stuff out of which new life comes. Let's go back to that Genesis 1 passage and read it again. First this, God created the heavens and the earth, all you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, and inky blackness, and God's Spirit brooded like a bird over the watery abyss. So notice the materials that God has at his disposal to create this good world. Emptiness, blackness, soup of nothingness, watery chaos. It's not great material, right? But there's also this. There's God brooding like a mother bird over all of this stuff. And we see again how God's creative power is compared to the creative power of a mother, just hovering and ready to give birth, ready to jump in. And what I think when I read this passage is that the biblical story, right from the very beginning, has been using suffering and death to create something new, something beautiful, to create something very good. Now, sometimes in an effort to make sense of pain, we hear people use platitudes like, everything happens for a reason. But I think the truth is deeper than that. Because I don't think things happen for a reason, like God puts his stamp of approval on the death or sickness of our children, or sickness of our loved ones, or the disintegration of relationships, or withering poverty. None of that is good in God's eyes. But what I do think is that Creator God is groaning and aching in the midst of all of that pain. And with these birth sounds, he is making something new. So, Eugene Peterson says this, suffering and death, the worst life can hand us, is the very stuff out of which salvation is fashioned. I want you to listen again to that last verse that we read in this Romans passage. I'm going to read it out to you. We can be sure that every detail in our life of love for God is worked into something good. I'm going to put it on the screen, and I want you to say it with me, okay? We can be sure that every detail in our lives of love for God is worked into something good. Let's say it one more time together. We can be sure that every detail in our lives of love for God is worked into something good. Write that down. Remind yourself of it. Tell your friends about it, and then tell them to remind you of it. Tattoo it on your body if you need to. Hand it out on the street corners. Become a hope dealer. God is making all things new, and every detail of your life of love for God is a part of it.